One morning, Juliet asked George, "Are you coming to the fiesta?" "Which fiesta?" George had recently attended 2 fiestas in the same week. He could see they provided Filipinos with a break from their routine, a chance to eat and enjoy each other's company. Today's fiesta was going to be in the barangay, or municipality, of Jovellar. My friend Carmelita from Victoria always told me, if you really want to know the Philippines, go in January. Juliet's husband, Jovellar, who spoke very little English, touched George's shoulder and said, "Fiesta." He mimicked eating and drinking. Food. Good. At 10 o'clock, the front and the back gates of the house were locked. Avelina, the daughter of Jovellar's first cousin, was staying behind to hold the fort. Apin had told George that although her cheery personality and physical attractiveness made her an appealing prospect to local men, 31-year-old Avelina had no plans to marry or have children. George asked her, "Why don't you come with us?" Apin answered on her behalf, "She doesn't like fiestas." Jovellar joked, "Pretty? Good wife." To George, Jovellar looked quite old, but in fact was younger than him. The message was clear. The man was trying to sell his niece. The family was still at the table when Hilario arrived with his wife Annalisa on a tricycle. As was common in the Philippines, Annalisa was in the sidecar while her husband was seated sideways behind the driver, his feet dangling. "George, come and sit next to me," Annalisa called out. As George got in, Annalisa said, "People open their doors to everyone. Filipinos are hospitable. Have you noticed, George?" The pin squeezed in as well, and they roared off. The barangay Jovellar was located a kilometer from Igbaras. George would have preferred to walk, but it didn't seem to be the norm. To get to school, neighborhood children preferred a tricycle ride to a 10-minute walk. Traffic on the highway, the local name for any unpaved road, was overwhelming. Two-way traffic shared a single lane, as the other was closed due to construction. "To be completed by next year," a pin shouted in George's ear. "The money will be gone before the end of the project." "There's also a disco tonight, by the way." "Where?" George asked. "On the playground of the school," Annalisa replied. "Do you dance?" George sighed. "In a previous life." A few minutes later, the passengers dismounted by the side of a house. At the back, a group of men were standing around a huge wok at least a meter wide, its contents sizzling over a wood fire. Boyette, who looked after Hilario's property when he and Annalisa were back in Canada, was in charge of the cooking. With a smile, Boyette invited George, "Come, come, eat." "What are you cooking?" Boyette removed the lid from the wok. A layer of banana leaves covered the food. "What are the banana leaves for?" George asked. One of Boyette's helpers replied, "Heat. Cooking." George had mentioned to Carmelita that the Aboriginals in Canada used to roast corn with the husks left on over a charcoal fire. "In the Philippines, we use banana leaves to keep the heat in so the food cooks faster. You will see when we go. People are poor, but there is always food for visitors." Boyette seized a long-handled shovel to stir the mixture under the leaves. He said the dish was called Valenciana. He scraped the sides of the wok and turned over the slightly burned rice from the bottom of the pan. "Want some?" he asked, with a big smile. The gathered crowd watched closely to see how the Kano foreigner would react. George had tasted the dish before, so he knew it was turmeric that gave the rice its signature yellow color, in contrast to the saffron used in Spanish paellas. Valenciana consisted of pillet, sticky rice, small pieces of pork liver, bell peppers, corn, and chickpeas. "I'd love some," he said eagerly. One of the extras handed him a square-cut banana leaf, and Boyette scooped a big spoon of Valenciana onto the leaf with a warning, "Hot! Hot!" George blew on the steaming food and took a bite. "It's delicious," he pronounced. This brought smiles all around. When he had finished eating, Annalisa invited him inside the house. "Whose house is this?" "It's Juana's." "Is she an overseas foreign worker?" "Yes." George learned that Juana was in the Philippines for her annual holidays. Like many of the houses belonging to foreign workers, this one was made out of concrete blocks covered by cement. It was 3 times bigger than the surrounding bamboo homes. Juana's living room was filled with guests watching a broadcast of the Dinagayan festival in Iloilo. George watched the screen for a moment. Young men and women in colorful costumes, the boys shirtless, danced and played musical instruments in a street closed to traffic. George looked around the room. George followed his hostess into a large dining room with several tables pushed together in a line. Several guests stood in the room, waiting to be called to the table. "The food won't be ready for another hour," Juana said. "Go and see my cousin Rosalie's house." Juana called one of the dozen children scampering around the house and said to the delicate-looking girl, "Take George to Tita Rosalie's house." She said to George, "Everything will be ready when you come back." The little girl, who was as tiny as a mouse, shouted, "Let's go!" George had noticed that Filipinos often said, "Let's go," with the emphasis on the last word, making it sound like a command, as if they were becoming impatient. Was the stress always on the last syllable in Tagalog? He wondered. He would have to consult a pin on the matter. Boyette saw him leaving the house and asked, "Where are you going?" "To Rosalie's." "She is not there. Eat, eat." "I'll be back." Following his mouse guide, George climbed the narrow path behind the house. When they reached the top of the hill, he halted, overwhelmed by the scenery below. "I want to take a picture." This was the epitome of a rural setting. Mountains surrounding fields divided into plots. In some fields, the peanut plants were just a foot high. Other fields were plowed, ready for the planting of rice during the rainy season. Cows stood apart from each other in several fields, each tethered to a picket by a cord to their nostrils. George was so overcome by the tranquil scene that he wanted to hug the little girl standing next to him. He settled for whispering, "You live in a beautiful country." He could hear Carmelita's voice again. "You will see when we go." His thoughts were interrupted by the familiar, "Let's go!" They arrived at a big cement house with no doors or windows. A woman in her 70s welcomed them. Her face was emaciated. Rosalie's mother, he assumed. "How old are you?" the woman asked. George didn't hesitate. 65. "And how old are you?" 64. "You know Rosalie?" "No, I live in Victoria and your daughter lives in Vancouver." With his eyes, George indicated the spacious living room with its wide doorway and the unusually high ceiling. "Your house is big." The woman remained silent. The house was a striking contrast with what he thought of as the third world desolation of the region. Traditional nipa huts, cows, wandering chickens and dogs, the ground littered with wood and metal, scraps mixed with plastic jars and bottles. Rosalie's mother took him through the house. The dirty kitchen was one of only 2 functional rooms. The other was the living room, occupied by, or rather invaded by, a large screen television and an array of audio equipment. Women brought a variety of dishes from the kitchen and set them on the dining table. One looked like some sort of stew. "Do you like pork?" one of them asked George. Without waiting for his answer, she handed him a spoon and commanded, "Eat, eat." On that day, the population of Jovellar went from one house to the next, eating and drinking. There were boys and girls of extraordinary beauty and old folks with missing teeth. They ate obsessively, as if in a trance, as if the goal was to blot out the hunger and the injustice of their entire country, not just their own individual hunger. They would ingest noodles, fish, and dinuguan, the dark brown stew made of pig organs and blood, jokingly known as chocolate pudding, then walk to another house and fill their plates again. From dawn to dusk, they ate for their starving ancestors. George recalled Carmelita's words, "This is part of our culture. Poor and rich eat at fiestas all over the country in January." George felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be, and was gratified to be witnessing something his old friend had grown up with. Born in a country where poverty and hunger were daily realities for most of the population, Carmelita had come to love chocolate, ice cream, cheesecakes, and any dessert prepared with half a dozen eggs. She loved watching male chefs on TV flirting with the audience as they mixed ingredients for whatever dish they were featuring on the show. when Carmelita entertained and told her guests, "Eat! Eat!" she was echoing what she had seen and heard as a child. In this way she stayed in touch with the poverty and hunger of her own people. All her life had been payback time, to her native self and, later, to the people who surrounded her in Canada. People she loved and was determined to care for.